He looked his brothers in the eye, felt the bitter almond of the cyanide coat his tongue, and realized his empire was built on sand. Just like that. No honor, no mercy. The sound of his heart stopping didn't echo through the penthouse. It was a silence so heavy it felt like lead. Kang Taesung, the immortal king of Seoul's underworld, slumped against the cold marble, his vision blurring into a gray void. As he fell, his lieutenants didn't rush to his side. They straightened their lapels, checked their watches, and toasted to the vacancy he'd left behind. They thought they were burying a tyrant. What they didn't see was the small, dark-skinned girl in a pink dress stepping out from the shadows of the servants' quarters. Amara, a 7-year-old who carried nothing but a heart full of stories and a power that defied the laws of the living. While the traitors laughed in the next room, she knelt in the silence of his death. She didn't see a monster worth billions or a dragon-tattooed killer. She saw the man who had secretly shielded her mother for 7 years. As she pressed a small, warm hand against the black silk of his suit, a golden light ignited that the dark world of the mafia was never meant to witness. With a single word, "Daddy," she reached into the abyss and pulled him back. The traitors believe the throne is empty. They believe a dead man tells no tales. But as the orange glow fades, and Taesung's lungs draw their first agonizing breath of stolen time, they are about to learn a lesson in blood. You can kill a boss, but you cannot kill a father who has been given a second chance by a miracle. The moment his heart beat again, they had already lost. They just didn't know it yet. In the world of the immortal, loyalty is rare, but a miracle is unheard of. If you believe some bonds are stronger than death, you found your way into the inner circle. Before the dragon wakes, tell us, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like and subscribe. The heart starts beating again. Now we begin. The laughter was the loudest thing in the room, sharp and jagged, cutting through the low hum of the string ensemble. Taesung leaned back in his velvet-lined chair, the golden embroidery of his sleeves catching the light of the swaying chandeliers. He looked every bit the king he believed himself to be, surveying the table with a predator's satisfaction. To his left, the ministers sat in a rigid row, their smiles pinned on like medals. Across from him, the very man who had spent a lifetime in his shadow offered a steady, silent gaze. To loyalty, Taesung declared, his voice booming with a confidence that bordered on derision. He didn't wait for a chorus of agreement. He never did. He reached for the crystal decanter, the dark crimson liquid swirling like a trapped storm within the glass. It is a rare vintage, much like a true friend, hard to find, and even harder to keep. The wine was cold, then suddenly searingly hot. He set the glass down with a heavy thud, beginning to deliver a remark about the body of the vintage, but the words died in his throat. A strange, numbing sensation crawled up his neck. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt as though it were being stitched shut with lead. The silence that followed was no longer respectful. It was predatory. Taesung's hand went to his collar, tugging at the silk. His eyes, once bright with triumph, clouded with a sudden, sharp panic. He looked at the man across the table, expecting to see a doctor called or a servant rushed forward. Instead, he saw a smile. It wasn't the practiced, subservient grin he was used to. It was a cold, finished expression. "The vintage is indeed rare, Taesung," the man said softly, his voice cutting through the ringing in Taesung's ears. "But loyalty is rarer. And you? You ran out of both a long time ago." Taesung tried to rise, his chair screeching against the marble floor, but his legs were water. As he collapsed back into the velvet, the world tilting into shadow, he realized the bitter truth. The feast wasn't a celebration of his reign, but a wake. The metallic tang of the wine was the last thing Taesung truly tasted, before his senses began to unravel. The heat that had started in his throat turned into a glacial, crushing weight behind his ribs. It wasn't the dramatic explosion of pain he might have expected from a king's assassination. It was a systematic shutdown, a series of internal shutters closing one by one. His pulse, once a drumbeat of frantic ego, began to stutter, losing its rhythm until it became a faint, irregular tapping against the walls of his arteries. The room began to bleed its color. The vibrant crimson of the spilled wine turned to a muddy charcoal, and the golden glow of the chandeliers faded into a sickly, washed-out pewter. The faces of the ministers, once sharp with hidden malice, softened into indistinct blurs of ash. Sound followed the light. The panicked scraping of chairs and the muffled gasps of the onlookers retreated into a long, hollow tunnel, replaced by a high-pitched hum that vibrated in his very marrow. Inside his chest, the muscular engine of his life gave a final, desperate heave. The sinoatrial node fired one last erratic spark, but the message failed to take. The valves, weary of the burden of his ambition, slipped into a permanent stillness. This was the sound of zero, not a silence, but a profound absence of vibration. The mechanical thrum of his existence simply ceased, leaving a void where a mountain of a man had just stood. As the physical heart surrendered, the spiritual tether began to fray. Taesung felt a strange, terrifying lightness, as if the gravity of the room no longer applied to his soul. He was no longer a monarch or a victim. He was merely a consciousness drifting in a colorless haze. The betrayal that had felt so sharp moments ago now seemed distant and inconsequential. A flicker of static in an expanding gray sea. There was no tumult of light, no ancestral welcome. There was only the stretching of a single second into an eternity of twilight. The world didn't end with a bang or a whimper. It simply faded into a dull, monochromatic blur. He tried to cling to the memory of his name, but even that slipped through his fingers like dry sand. In the absolute quiet of his own cessation, the great Taesung was reduced to a ghost in a kingdom of fog, watching as the final remnants of the living world dissolved into a silent, colorless nothing. The gray didn't stay silent for long. Before the void could claim Taesung entirely, a sound began to pulse through the fog. Not a heartbeat, but a low, rhythmic murmur that smelled of frankincense and rain. It was the sound of Naomi's voice, a steady anchor in the drifting ash. Naomi had always moved through the house like a shadow, her presence a necessity that Taesung had eventually stopped seeing. To him, she was merely the efficient hands that pressed his linens, and the quiet footsteps that brought his tea. He had never cared to look into the deep mahogany depths of her eyes, or wonder how a daughter of the Georgia red clay had ended up in a cold, concrete fortress in Seoul. Years ago, Naomi had been a woman running from a world that had tried to hollow her out. She had arrived in the city with nothing but a frayed Bible, and a resilience that felt like iron. She was a stranger in a land of sharp angles and hidden meanings, a black woman navigating a sea of faces that either looked through her or lingered too long with suspicion. It was Taesung who had eventually found her, not out of kindness, but out of a predator's instinct for spotting a tool that would never break. He was a Korean wolf, a man feared for his bite and admired for his ruthlessness. In his house, Naomi found a strange sort of sanctuary. He didn't ask for her story, and she didn't ask for his soul. He gave her a roof and a wage. She gave him the invisible labor that kept his life polished to a high shine. She became the keeper of his secrets by virtue of her silence, watching the power plays and the betrayals from the periphery of the dining room. Now, as Taesung lay suspended in the gray, Naomi stood over the wreckage of the feast, while the others scrambled in a panic or retreated in guilt. She moved toward him with a slow, deliberate grace. She didn't see the fallen titan or the arrogant king. She saw a man whose breath had finally run out of lies. She reached out, her dark hand a stark contrast against his cooling, pale skin, and closed his eyes. Her lips moved in a prayer she had carried across an ocean, a plea for a soul that had never known how to ask for one. It was a soft, melodic hum, the kind used to soothe restless children or bury broken men. In that moment, the maid was the only thing standing between the wolf and the absolute dark. Her voice the final thread connecting him to a world that was already moving on. The prayer Naomi whispered was still vibrating in the heavy air when the heavy oak doors creaked open, admitting a sliver of light and a small, frantic figure. Amara didn't look at the disarray of the feast or the frozen, ashen faces of the men who had just witnessed a murder. Her eyes were locked on the slumped form in the velvet chair, the man who had been a mountain in her world, now reduced to a silent monument of stone. Amara, no. Stay back. Her mother's voice was a jagged scream, a desperate plea to keep her child away from the stench of death and the shifting shadows of the room. But the command hit Amara like a gust of wind against a cliff, meaningless and unable to move her. She didn't feel the fear that should have rooted her to the spot. Instead, she felt a pull, a magnetic tugging deep within her chest that drowned out the panic of the living. She moved with a singular, quiet purpose, her small shoes clicking softly against the marble. Naomi looked up, her prayer faltering as she saw the girl approach. There was a gravity in Amara's expression that transcended her years, a solemnity that seemed to push back the gray haze still clinging to the room. When she reached the chair, she didn't recoil from the coldness of Taesung's skin. She reached out, her fingers small and delicate, and pressed them against the center of his chest, right over the silent engine that had ceased its work. At first, there was only the cold, but then a flicker. It started as a pinprick of warmth beneath her palm, a tiny, defiant spark in the absolute dark. It wasn't the harsh, artificial glare of the chandeliers, but a soft, honeyed glow that seemed to bleed directly from her skin. The light was ancient and gold, pulsing with a rhythm that ignored the sound of zero that had claimed the room. Naomi gasped, drawing back as the air around Amara's hands began to shimmer with a sudden, localized heat. The gray world that had swallowed Taesung's spirit suddenly shuddered. The gold didn't just illuminate the skin. It seemed to sink through the silk of his shirt, diving deep into the stagnant muscle of his heart. Amara's eyes remained closed, her brow furrowed in intense concentration. She wasn't just touching him. She was reaching into the void, her small hand acting as a bridge for a power she didn't yet understand. The scream of her mother, the betrayal of the wine, and the politics of the wolf's den all fell away, leaving only the girl and the golden spark, fighting to reignite a life that had already been declared lost. The golden spark from Amara's touch acted like a flare launched into a midnight sea. For Taesung, the gray expanse of the void suddenly fractured, tearing open to reveal a gallery of the ghosts he had spent a lifetime manufacturing. He was no longer drifting. He was falling through a corridor of his own making, lined with the faces of the broken, There were the business rivals he had decimated with a single stroke of a pen, their eyes hollow and accusing. There were the former allies whose reputations he had scorched to build his own throne, and the families whose livelihoods had been the collateral damage of his expansion. Their voices didn't scream. They were a collective, suffocating whisper, a tidal wave of why that pressed against his spirit until he felt he would shatter. He tried to turn away, to assert the dominance that had served him so well in the light. But in this hollow place, his titles carried no weight. He was stripped bare, a man defined only by the shadows he had cast. The faces crowded closer, a suffocating tapestry of his cruelty. The cold returned, sharper than before, as the wait of 3 minutes without breath began to pull him toward a permanent descent. The corridor was narrowing, the gray turning to a final heavy black. Then a sound pierced the cacophony of the silenced. It wasn't the roar of a king or the prayer of a saint. It was a high, clear bell that rang through the darkness, shattering the images of his victims like glass. Daddy, the word was a tether, warm and impossibly solid. It didn't belong in this place of reckoning. The faces of the hurt dissolved into golden dust. As Amara's voice vibrated through the marrow of his soul, it was a command more powerful than any he had ever issued. A call to return, not to his power or his pride, but to the small, warm hand currently pressed against his frozen heart. The void shuddered. The 3-minute silence that had sat upon his chest like a tombstone cracked. The voice didn't judge him. It simply claimed him. It pulled him back from the edge of the abyss, dragging his consciousness through the layers of gray and smoke, toward the heat. He felt the sudden, violent rush of the world returning, the smell of the poisoned wine, the sting of the chandeliers, and the terrifying, agonizing thrum of a heart being shocked back into a rhythm it didn't deserve. Taesung gasped, a ragged, desperate sound that tore through the silence of the dining hall.
His eyes snapped open, to find the gold fading from his daughter's fingertips. He was back. But the faces from the dark remained burned into the backs of his eyelids. A permanent stain on the king's new life. The return of life was not a gentle awakening, it was a violent collision between the soul and the cage of the body. As Taesung's lungs seized their first gulp of air, it felt like swallowing broken glass. The oxygen burned, a searing tide of fire that rushed into his dormant alveoli, forcing them open with agonizing force. His ribs, which had been a heavy tune just moments ago, now throbbed with the raw, rhythmic ache of a heartbeat that refused to stay silent. The physical sensation was one of pins and needles magnified 1,000 times. A static charge racing through his veins, as blood, thick and sluggish, began to circulate once more. The metallic poison still lingered, a bitter ghost on his tongue. But the golden heat from Amara's touch acted as an internal cautery, sealing the cracks in his system. He could feel the precise moment the paralysis broke. It was like a dam bursting, a sudden, chaotic rush of warmth that flooded his limbs and forced a spasmodic twitch into his fingers. As the physical world rushed back, the ethereal orange glow that had enveloped the girl began to retreat. It didn't vanish all at once, it pulled back slowly, like a sunset receding from a dark room. The light shimmered one last time, a faint halo around Amara's small, trembling hand. Before it sank back into her skin, leaving nothing but the ordinary paleness of a child's grip. The heat in the air dissipated, replaced by the sterile, cold drafts of the dining hall. And the scent of extinguished candles. Taesung's eyes snapped open. The gray was gone. In its place, was a world that felt too sharp, too vivid.
The deep mahogany of the table, the glint of the silver chalice, and the terrified, sweating faces of the men who had watched him die, were etched into his vision with terrifying clarity. He looked up, his pupils blown wide and dark, meeting the gaze of the man who had poisoned him. The betrayer's face had gone from a mask of triumph, to a portrait of pure, unadulterated horror. To the room, it was a medical impossibility, a Lazarus effect that defied every law of nature. But to Tae-sung, it was a heavy, unwanted burden. He didn't rise with the grace of a king, he slumped forward, coughing a dark, viscous fluid onto the white lace tablecloth, his body trembling under the weight of its own resurrection. He was alive, but as he looked at Amara's exhausted face, he knew the man who had died in that chair was never coming back. The wolf had been brought to heel by a miracle, and the silence that followed was louder than any scream. The office was a tomb of glass and polished brass, perched high above the city's glowing arteries. The traders had already begun to divide the spoils, their voices loud and jagged as they moved through the sanctuary of the man they believed was a corpse. They didn't even notice the smudge of dark, viscous wine on the edge of the mahogany desk, or the lingering scent of ozone that still clung to the air. They were too busy tasting the air of a new era, convinced the wolf was buried under the weight of his own arrogance. The heavy doors clicked shut behind them, sealing the room. A silhouette stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, framed by the cold, electric blue of the skyline. He was motionless, a dark tear in the fabric of the room's celebration. The men froze. The laughter died in their throats, replaced by a suffocating pressure that seemed to drain the oxygen from the space. It was a ghost's posture, but the shoulders were too broad, the presence too heavy, to be a mere memory. The view is different when you aren't looking at it through a shroud, Tae-sung said. His voice was a rasping blade, scarred by the poison, but fueled by a terrifying, new vitality. As he turned, the city lights caught the unnatural sharpness of his gaze, eyes that had seen the grey void, and returned with its coldness. The men recoiled, one of them stumbling against a brass display case, that rang out with a sharp, dissonant chime. Tae-sung didn't rush. He moved with a predatory, deliberate grace, that was more unsettling than a scream. He walked toward his desk, the space where they had already laid out the papers for the dissolution of his empire. With a slow, steady hand, he swept the documents onto the floor. They fluttered like the wings of dying birds. "You thought the wine was a period," he whispered, leaning over the desk until he was inches from the man who had poured the glass. "It was only a comma." The reclamation was swift and bloodless in the physical sense, but spiritually devastating. He didn't call for guards or police, he simply reached into the desk, and pulled out a single, brass-bound ledger, the record of every debt, every sin, and every secret he had kept on them for a decade. He laid it on the desk, like a guillotine blade. The traders looked at the book, then at the man who had literally walked out of the dark. Their power evaporated. In the face of a man who had conquered zero, their petty ambitions felt like dust. Tae-sung sat in his chair, the king returning to a throne that still smelled of his own death, and watched as they withered before him. The Lazarus effect was complete, he had his life back, and now, he would take theirs. The office grew quiet, the heavy brass clock on the mantel ticking with the weight of a metronome in a cathedral. The traders had been scoured from the room like dust, leaving only Tae-sung, and the woman who had stood over his corpse with a prayer. He stood and walked toward her, but the predatory edge had softened into something heavier, something almost like exhaustion. "You thought it was a coincidence. A black woman from the American South, a man of iron in soul, meeting in a gutter of circumstance. You thought I hired you for your discretion or your hands." Naomi tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. "I thought you hired me because I knew how to be invisible, Mr. Kong." "No," Tae-sung whispered, stopping a few feet from her. The city lights behind him cast a long, jagged shadow across the floor. "I kept you close because of the scent. Not of incense, but of the light." He turned back to the window, watching the rain begin to streak the glass. "I knew what Amara was from the moment she took her first breath. I saw the spark in her cradle, the same one that just dragged me back from the dark. But a spark without a hearth is just a fire that burns itself out. I needed someone who had lived in the fire. Someone whose ancestors had survived the impossible, whose very blood was a covenant of endurance." He looked at her then, and for the first time, the Korean wolf looked small against the vastness of his own secret. I didn't bring you here to serve me, Naomi. I brought you here to be the vessel for her. I knew the day would come when my own sins would catch up to me, and I knew I couldn't be the one to guide her through the power she carries. You were the only one who could look at a miracle and not blink. For 7 years. I have kept the wolves at bay, so you could keep her soul intact. Naomi's breath hitched, the realization rippling through her. The 7 years of mundane labor, the quiet observations, the isolated sanctuary, it wasn't a job. It was a long, slow preparation for a war of spirits. Taesung hadn't just been building an empire, he had been building a fortress around a miracle, with Naomi as its silent, iron gate. The sliding glass door hummed as it retracted, letting the crisp, evening air of Seoul flood into the penthouse. Taesung didn't flinch at the chill. He stepped onto the balcony, with a measured, predatory grace that hadn't been there before the accident. Beside him, Amara's presence was a steady anchor, her hand resting lightly on the crook of his arm. The city stretched out before them, a sprawling tapestry of neon blues and burning ambers. From this height, the cars looked like blood cells pumping through the veins of a concrete giant. For weeks, the rumors had been a slow-acting poison in the streets: the boss is dead. The throne is empty. Taesung leaned against the marble railing, his silhouette cutting a sharp, unforgiving line against the glow of the skyscrapers. He didn't need to shout to be heard, the mere act of standing there, visible, was a declaration of war. "They're watching," Amara whispered, her voice barely carrying over the distant hum of the traffic. "Let them," Taesung replied. His voice was different now, deeper, carrying a resonant weight that seemed to vibrate in the very air. "Let them see that the fire didn't take me. It only burned away what was weak." He looked down at his hands. They were steady. There was a terrifying clarity in his gaze. The man who had been a father, a businessman, and a leader, had been replaced by something far more permanent. Below, in the shadows of the streetlights, men in black suits stepped out of cars, looking up in stunned silence. The word would spread. By morning, everything would change. Taesung turned slightly toward Amara, the neon light catching the unnatural stillness in his eyes. "The city thinks it knows me," he said. "They think they're waiting for the return of a king." A pause. Cold. Final. "They have no idea, they're looking at a god." He didn't smile. He simply stood there, an immortal sentinel draped in silk and shadow, while the world below began to tremble, at the realization that the boss hadn't just survived. He had conquered death itself.